Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for the question. Sorry, starting a couple minutes late here. My name is Kevin Mosher, and welcome to the July edition of the HR Best Practices webinar series from Thompson Co. I'm a partner up at the Minnesota office and certified specialist in labor and employment law, and it's my pleasure to present this to you today. I was thinking about it today, and I believe this is the fifth year that exactly 5 years ago this month that we started doing these in a webinar format. So I didn't bring cake or anything into the office, but that probably would have been a good idea. Anyway, 5 years, and I'm excited that we're doing the mid-year legislative review, something I've gotten in the habit of doing the last several years, just kind of catching up. There's been so much, with most of the many of the legislatures around the country having early year sessions. I understand some legislatures are on a biennial meeting basis, but most legislatures meet annually as well. So there's always a lot of stuff to go on. And there was an election last November. I'm assuming you're familiar with that. And so we've seen, a couple things out of the new executive administration. And Congress has even done some, not a lot, but they've talked about doing some things. So we'll talk about what they've at least talked about doing, and kind of catch up on HR in 2017. Year's halfway over, so it's kind of crazy. If you have any any questions, you are welcome to post them in the question section. I see somebody just sent me a link for a birthday cake for cupcakes. That's fantastic. Thank you, Christina. So you're welcome to put them in the questions section on there. I will see them, and if I get to them, I'll try to get to them as we go on here. And anything I don't get to, I'll try to reach out and get a hold of the person, or send out something generally if I feel like it's important for the whole group to see. If you are here for CLE credits, or you're here for HRCI or SHRM credits, you'll get your certifications in the mail. Starting next month, we knock on wood, we can never say we're certified until we actually get the certification, but we'll be applying for Illinois. Starting in August, we'll be applying for Illinois CLEs as well. So for those of you who are attorneys in Illinois, you should be able to get your CLE credits. Okay. Let's move on. We have actually a bunch of things, surprisingly, to talk about, because states actually do things, unlike the federal government. So I'm just kidding. Federal governments try to do a couple things. So we're going to talk about just some more minor last-minute changes. We'll talk about minimum wages. Some of these issues, Working Family Flexibility Act, new Form I-9. A lot of this stuff has been in the works for a long time now. And ACA, you're probably familiar with the Affordable Care Act. That's been in the news a little bit as well. So I'm totally being facetious on half this. So anyway, a lot of what we are going to talk about today, it's been in the works. So some of what we want to kind of focus on here, not just today, but through these webinars, and every January we do kind of a catch up, look back, look forward type webinar, but we want to see where the trends are going, because so often it takes years for the trends to develop by the time that we actually see it effectuated into legislation or executive action, or protests on the streets, that sort of thing. So it's good to kind of keep active, and to have our eye on what the undercurrent is, because a lot of times the undercurrent eventually becomes impactful over time. More minor notable laws that have or actions that have been taken recently. This week, the Trump administration announced 15,000 additional H-2B visas for low-wage foreign workers. Those are H-2B visas are not for long-term placement. Those are for short-term workers. I just recently took my kids to the Wisconsin Dells. And for those of you who are from the Midwest and have taken your kids to the Wisconsin Dells, it's a great time, and they love water parks and everything. But it is an international land of mystery over over there in the Wisconsin Dells for a town of 8,000 people. I would say half of the workers there are foreign workers, and they're recruited from Europe, from South America to come and work in the industry. So H-2B visas are normally to help employers get short-term workers for like agriculture and hospitality, like President Trump's golf courses, those sorts of, coming in. There's also the H-2A, which is more for agriculture. But yeah, those are for short term. Normally we're looking at like 90 days that people are coming in on these H-2B visas. So I believe they can be extended to up to 6 months, and then you have to and then the person has to leave. So kind of strange that the administration, to me, after all the campaign promises, would add 15,000 H-2B visas, which are low paid and they're uneducated, but then at the same time talk about scaling back H-1Bs, which probably has a greater impact for most of you on this call, which are for skilled workers. And right now we only get like 65,000 H-1B visa people, and those are IT professionals and people with specialized degrees and like STEM degrees and stuff like that. So it's just kind of strange that this administration would want to increase the number of H-2B visas, but then look at restricting accessibility to H-1Bs. There's also, in the last 2 weeks, for those of you who are on the HR hotline program and get the HR tips of the week, I've done one recently on the action on the overtime pay loss. So the new regulations that the Obama administration had put together had talked about, obviously, I know you're all familiar, but for white-collar workers, for white-collar professional, administrative, and executive workers, moving the salary basis level, the salary level on the exempt test, moving that level up to, I think off the top of my head, like $913 per hour. Right now it's $435 per, not $913 per hour, $913 per week. Right now it's $435 per week. That a person has to be paid on a salary basis, so the salary level is $435, moving that up to $913. So there was this judge in Texas who put a hold on it and put an injunction on the implementation of those regulations. And that occurred at the beginning of December in 2016, which is why we don't have to pay our white-collar exempt and administrative and professional employees at least $913 per hour. And the judge had put the injunction on it. Well, the administration had continued to fight it. And it was interesting because, you would just knee-jerk think, oh, the administration will just like stop fighting this case. But the way that the judge ruled on it, the administration what they're basically doing now is they're saying, no, Judge, the Department of Labor has the ability to do this. We want the ability to change the salary level test. We think you're wrong in that, Judge. We want the ability to change it, but then they're stepping back from the Obama administration. They're saying, however, we don't necessarily want to move it up to 913. So we've seen that in some recent court filings in the last couple of weeks. And so I think what we can glean from this, and we if we look at the testimony that the current Department of Labor, head had said in testimony, is that he had said that he believed that 913 was just a bridge too far. It was too much, and I think that echoes what we've seen out of like the chambers of commerce and the business community just generally as a whole, jumping from 435 to 913 essentially overnight. That was a big step. And we've got the blue dog Democrats in Congress and some moderate Republicans saying, why don't we do some sort of tiered increase where eventually we get to 913, but we scale it over a period of years, which is what we see routinely with minimum wage increases, where they're scaled over a period of years while they're implemented. And so I think we can glean from these court filings, from this testimony at confirmation hearings for these various Department of Labor people, that we're going to see something from the Department of Labor. What we don't know, it's not going to be $913 per week. So we're not going to jump up to $47,000 per year, 47,000 and change per year for a salary level test. It might be somewhere, it's probably going to be somewhere in between 435 and per week and 913 per week. Or it might be some sort of, slow implementation where we eventually get up to 913. So pay attention. I think there's going to be some movement on this. The other changes, there might be more substantive changes beyond that. I have no idea. There's been the Department of Labor has not shown its hand at all, other than just to say a couple of these things. So that's something that we definitely want to keep on the radar. DACA, another recent, as of I want to say this week, where suddenly like DACA, which the president had said he likes DACA, and DACA, if you're not familiar, DACA is so it's the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, and that's where children who are, off the top of my head, under 16 years of age when they're brought into the United States by their parents, they're considered to have been essentially brought here to the United States against their will, and so they're just going with their families, and so they're illegal in the United States. But then if they go to school and they go to college and they graduate and they don't commit crimes and they have a clean criminal history, then they're able to then they've, under the Obama administration executive order that went into effect several years ago, they've been able to seek this DACA approval, and they've been able to get legitimate legal work authority in the United States. Now, their status in the United States is fairly precarious because it's by executive order. Congress wasn't able to pass anything on this, on DACA, and so it's up to executive order. And executive orders, as we've seen, we see with most administrations when they switch parties, executive orders, can be done and they can be undone by a swipe of a pen. And we'll talk about some executive orders that President Trump has signed, basically undoing Obama administration executive orders. So DACA was considered, that President Trump had said that he actually likes DACA. I mean, these are college grads. These are college grads that don't get into trouble, with the law, and they were children when they initially came over. And so there's some general sympathy for them, I think, and these are, people that are members of the community and probably long-term employees, maybe for some of you. And so President Trump had been saying that he's okay with them. Like that we're not going to undo DACA. But then this week, since the Affordable Care Act has tanked, suddenly we're talking about DACA being off the table. So I don't know if that's a bone that's being thrown to, anti-immigration groups or people or whatever it is. But for whatever reason, once the ACA went off the table, like suddenly we're talking about DACA maybe being undone, and that's getting people all riled up. So we'll see what happens with that. Again, a lot of you might have current employees who have work authority that they're getting through DACA. You would notice that because it would be in the form of an employment authorization card. That could be one of the statuses that's giving them the employment authorization card. So we need to watch this because it might affect a lot of workers. I believe statistically there's over 500,000 people in the United States on this. And again, these are all fairly young adults that are probably into their careers as college grads. The Trump administration has also recently talked about backing away from the board position that class action waivers are invalid. So the NLRB has taken a lot of, in my opinion, some kind of out there, readings, aggressive opinions on the National Labor Relations Act, and how we've seen this with a lot of handbook provisions over the last 10 years where the NLRB is starting to stick its nose into employee handbooks, whether there's a union or not. And one of the areas is the NLRB had taken the position that class action waivers are invalid. And so if you had in your employment agreement or handbook or whatever, normally an employment agreement where there's a waiver, NLRB has been saying recently, no, but the Trump administration has come out and said that they will not support that rule any longer. So go and enjoy your class action waivers or if you've got them right now and know that they're a little bit more enforceable, at least on the NLRB side. Okay, now let's talk about some of the more substantive things, though I think those were pretty substantive as well. Minimum wage updates. Again, we've been talking about minimum wage updating for the last several years, and I talk about this pretty frequently just because it's one of those areas where there's just been a lot of action at the state and local level. A lot of grassroots unions are really getting behind it, have been for several years. They see it as a way of organizing, and a lot more states are coming up, are raising up their minimum wages. So we saw a bunch of minimum wages raised as of July 1. And now you can see the number there, 29 states and Washington, D.C. have a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage. So federal minimum wage is like $7.25. Some states have that are actually lower than the federal minimum wage, but for the most part, most employers that are doing commerce, interstate commerce, using computers and phones and credit card machines and stuff, are going to be beholden to the federal minimum wage. But the definite trend is to raise up the minimum wages at the state and local levels. What we have started to see is a pushback from a lot of these states where the local governments might be, let's just, for lack of a better way of describing it, more liberal, and so more in line with what unions are looking at, and more willing to jump up to like a $15 minimum wage. I think we even have a slide on that. Yeah, so jumping up to more of a $15 minimum. So we've seen a lot of these more metropolitan areas that are more progressive, more liberal, whatever you want to call them, but they're more likely to raise the minimum wage. And so we've just seen that in Minneapolis. Just was passed very recently by ordinance by the government, where Minneapolis is now going to go up to $15 per hour. It's going to scale, but eventually it'll be $15 an hour in 2022, and for smaller employers, it's going to be $15 per hour in 2024. But we've started to see this in several of the big cities in California. We've seen it in Seattle. We've seen it all over. New York City as well has scaled it. So there are a lot of cities. There's now some states coming on board with this $15 an hour minimum wage. In Minnesota and in a lot of these states and cities, one of the big issues is the tip credit, and how whether or not to implement the tip credit and allow tipped employees. So for those of you in hospitality that have servers, people who are able to get tip credits and offset the minimum wage, you can use some of the tip credit. So for example, under federal law, you could use some of the tip credit toward going toward, I think it's like 518 of it or something, toward going toward the minimum wage. So you don't have to, as an employer, you don't have to pay that full amount. So for most businesses outside hospitality, it doesn't really have any effect. But for tipped employees for hospitality, it's critical that we get this sort of tip credit, because otherwise you're in Seattle or you're in Minneapolis and you're paying these servers $15 per hour, and then they're getting tips on top of it, which can just be ridiculous. The other trend that we're seeing, so in response to so many of these more metropolitan progressive liberal cities raising their minimum wages up to $15 per hour, we're also seeing a statewide response where there's more pushback. So for example, I always think of Austin. Austin's a great example. Minneapolis and St. Paul are becoming great examples too recently. But Austin's a good example of a city that might make or would like to make some moves on these minimum wages and other employee type benefits. But then the state of Texas comes down and says, well, yeah, but we're not going to let cities, we're not going to let counties make these moves. So the states that are more less progressive, less liberal, less employee friendly, the states then take away the power from those cities, from those counties, to effectuate these higher minimum wages and these higher employee benefits. And so we're actually seeing kind of a tug of war right now between these metropolitan cities and some of these more generally conservative Republican states, where those states are trying to put the kibosh on these cities, because the idea is that, well, if Austin does it, then Dallas is going to do it, then Houston's going to do it, then San Antonio is going to do it. Everywhere is going to, before long, you're going to have to pay $15 in West Texas to pay somebody to pump gas or whatever it is. So it just doesn't make any sense. It might work in Dallas, it might work in Austin, but it doesn't work in West Texas. Similar argument that we just went through in the Twin Cities and the state of Minnesota, where the Republicans were pushing. And it was part of the final negotiations that, ended up with a special session, all the, lack of budget and all that type of stuff that goes on seemingly every year between the governor and the legislative branch. And that was the big thing. That was one of the big sticky points for the Republicans that control the House and the Senate in Minnesota, where they said, we're not going to let Minneapolis and St. Paul pass these sick and safety leave laws, and we're not going to let those two cities pass this $15 an hour minimum wage. We don't like that. We don't want all the other metropolitan areas to do it. We don't want outstate, the rural areas to suddenly have to be paying sick and safety leave, and we don't want this to be a snowball effect where it affects the entire state. And that was like one of the final sticking points, and eventually, the Republicans lost on that. And so as a result, Minneapolis and St. Paul now have sick and safety leave laws, and Minneapolis is now able to implement a $15 an hour minimum wage. But a lot of other states are having better success. Republicans are having better success in stifling the more progressive cities. Here are some other states that have recently, and again, those of you who get the tip of the week that I send out, I've done some charts on these cities and towns and cities and states that have been implementing the new minimum wages. But you can see it's not, for the most part, the minimum wages are increasing on the coasts and in select areas like Chicago and Cook County and Minneapolis and St. Paul and Minnesota. Generally, we're seeing minimum wage increases, but it's starting to, that's the low-hanging fruit, right? The coasts and some select progressive areas in the Midwest. So low-hanging fruit for this minimum wage and paid sick and safety leave stuff. But we are starting to see it infiltrate into less obviously progressive areas of the country. The federal government's been unable to do anything on the minimum wage for a long time. So I think the way to that the locals and the unions and everything have been having a lot of great success is by doing this, these grassroots efforts, and it seems to be working really well for them. The only other thing, so here are the positives and negatives. You can read them. I'm not gonna read it out loud. What's really interesting out of all of this is, there are obviously studies, or there are think tanks, on both sides, and conservative and liberal, or however they want to be defined, think tanks on this. But what's really interesting is Seattle was the first city that really went with this $15 minimum wage at a metropolitan level. And what's interesting is that there was so far a pretty well respected study, not one of those that's like overly, left or right, but from what I've seen about it, it seems to be getting a lot of respect. And the interesting thing is that based on the analysis that was done by this group, they're saying that Seattle's move to $15 for a minimum wage has actually suppressed workers' overall income by on average $125 a month. This is the rallying cry for the anti $15 minimum wage group. So let's just call it the right on this, because I think that's politically where it tends to go. So I will be really curious to see how this impacts the debate going forward, because for the most part, most of the studies that have been out there have shown little to no impact by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. But we just didn't have a lot of statistics. We didn't have a lot of data points on this. Seattle's been doing this the longest, and so this study has the potential to have the most data available to it, and it's showing $125 per month overall loss per worker because of the raise. It might not have measured other quality of life things, but if anybody's interested, I don't know how to get a hold of that study, but I know it was just published about 3 weeks ago, and so I will be curious how it impacts some of these other less low-hanging fruit cities in Middle America and in the South that might be looking to raise the minimum wage, because if the counter is it really doesn't help people because the jobs flee to the suburbs or they flee across county or state lines, then that's not really an overall good thing for the workers when all said and done. So it'd be interesting, worth following for sure. Okay, jumping from minimum wage, the Working Families Flexibility Act is actually something one body of the Congress has passed. So that's, we can all be really excited that the House of Representatives passed the whatever redo of the Affordable Care Act, whatever they were calling it. So they did something. They've also passed this Working Families Flexibility Act, which on its face kind of seems like a no-brainer, like not that bad. But unions don't really like it, and pro-employee groups don't really like it, and it has yet to go anywhere in the Senate. I wouldn't be surprised if this act, it's not that bad. I mean, it can be slightly bipartisan, and so what it basically does is it does what the public sector does. It allows people who, instead of being paid overtime, cash money for working overtime, 1.5 times regular rate of pay, we're talking about non-exempt employees. So if for those employees, it is, they're able to actually, at their option, take that 1.5 hours, take the equivalent, and take 1.5 hours of comp time, more paid time off. The benefit to employers is that, well, it's less money out of pocket. It's employees maybe taking more paid time off, and that can be good for health reasons and all that. And maybe it kind of takes some of the pressure off of having to have a really great paid time off policy. It just allows for flexibility. Employers, it's an option. Employers can't mandate employees to take it, but if employees at their option could take it. And it would be at 1.5 times, just like the overtime rate is 1.5 times regular rate of pay. It would take some doing on the payroll side, but I'm sure the software companies would be able to figure this out. But it would be eligible to employees who have worked at least 1,000 hours in a 12-month period. So not all employees, not just employees that have worked about 6 months, that sort of thing. Kind of along the lines of like an FMLA eligibility, though FMLA is $1,250, but a little bit less than that. But this could be good. This could be really good for employees. This is what state governments allow all the time. They allow you to bank comp time. The counter argument on this from the unions and from pro-employee groups is, so you start from the premise that employers are evil. And you start from the premise that employers, in being evil, that they're going to try to, put one over on their employees. And so when you start from those two premises, so they're like, employers are evil, employers are trying to put one over on employees. 3, by allowing for comp time is something that employers, the company, could still like approve or not approve, right? So generally, most of us have paid time off policies, vacation, sick leave policies that say, well, you've got to give some sort of notice, whether it's like 7 days or 10 days or 14 days, but you've got to give some sort of notice. Otherwise, it's an unpaid leave of absence, and it's unexcused absence. Unexcused absence, not unpaid leave of absence. So you can discipline employees for just taking time off without proper notification. And so the idea is that employers are going to put the screws to the employees by not really letting them use all this banked comp time. And then the unions would rather, and the pro-employee groups would just rather that employees are just given cash because they've earned it. So that's kind of the counter argument. To me, I mean, if the fact that even under this bill passed by the House of Representatives, the fact that employees can choose or not choose, I mean, you have to be, it's pretty paternalistic to not to not want to give employees the option. But this has been something, this whole overtime thing has been in place since 1.5 times regular rate of pay since the Great Depression. So it's hard to, it is hard to make changes, but I would not be surprised, because I don't think this is overly controversial, at least in my mind, but I am biased. I don't think it's so controversial that we couldn't actually get the Senate to pass something along these lines. So I would not be surprised that if in the next, well, maybe before the next election, that the Senate actually passes something along these lines. So pay attention to that, because it could be a really great thing for your businesses, mainly so that you can save on a lot of overtime pay, and so that you can eventually put the screws to the employees to deprive them of using the comp time, and therefore you save all the money, right? So, okay, that was kind of a joke, but not entirely. All right, so new Form I-9 just came out last week. Actually, I'm sorry, Monday. It's been released on Monday. You can start to use it. If you want to get it, it's at USCIS. My tip of the week last week, posted about the changes here on this, and a link to the form. So new form, we just started with the old form that just started up in January, and so we're all the way onto another new form. You're going to have to start using this form no later than September 18th. So if you want to start using it now, that's great. But if you don't want to use it, you definitely have to start using it September 18th, 2017. So if you've got a bunch of paper supply of the old form that just came out 6 months ago, that's fine. But like I said, drop dead September 18th, 2017. The form doesn't have a ton of changes. So these are the changes that we saw. It was mainly making it into a smart form 6 months ago. So that was the big thing. There were some formatting changes to the I-9 about 6 months ago that we've seen, making it into a smart form with some drop downs and QR code and that sort of thing. So that's been good, and I think people for the most part have liked using the smart form. I haven't gotten a lot of complaints, but I didn't issue it, so I appreciate everybody not complaining to me, because I really had nothing to do with it other than to pass on the good or bad news. But so the new form that's going to take effect starting September 18th that you can get online now is, here are the changes to it. Just some sort of consolidation on birth abroad reports, and a slight change of this ridiculously long government agency to a sleet down. See, people that say that the Trump administration hasn't done anything, look at this. This is like progress right here. The office, so changing the name from the Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices, whoever named that should no longer be in government. I mean, that's a ridiculously terrible name for a government agency. So it's now called the Immigrant and Employee Rights Section. Like, there you go, streamlining government right there. The T-shirts, that the employees wear, that's much shorter. They don't have to get like 2 T-shirts to have the whole name of the agency on there. It's just Immigrant and Employee Rights Section. So I think that's great government in action, and I'm really glad about that change. The otherwise, it's just mainly some form changes, some a little bit different verbiage on the form. I don't think you're going to really, if I didn't point this stuff out to you, you probably would not have even noticed. But the key is that you have to start using the new form September 18th. Otherwise, you will be out of compliance. Trump executive orders. So here are some executive orders that we've seen in the last 6 months since, or at least since the administration took over. So rescinding the Fair Pay Safe Workplaces Act, which is basically saying that, which was something that President Obama had passed, saying that federal contractors had to could be sued for discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender stereotyping, and gender identity. Those are, so sexual orientation, gender identity, gender stereotyping. Those are protected classes by many states like Minnesota and California and a lot of other states. Protect those, but at the federal level, they don't. So if you're in Texas, you don't have to really worry about sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination claims from employees, but in Minnesota we do. And at the federal government, we didn't have to, but contractors were able to be sued under the Obama administration executive order, so that's been rescinded. So now federal contractors generally can discriminate away based on these three otherwise protected classes. The other change that the Trump administration has done is to recommend that employers promote hire American policies. I don't know what that means, but that's I guess we're going to start to see from the Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security various communications and maybe some regulations about hiring Americans, but we haven't seen anything along those lines yet. What has been, for me, I get a lot of, I subscribe to a lot of news feeds, and if you wanted to subscribe to news feeds as well, just let me know. You could just go to the Department of Labor website or the Department of Homeland Security, and you could subscribe to like various news feeds. So I get a lot of those. And the one thing that's interesting is under the Obama administration, when I was getting the immigration, so ICE, so Immigration Customs Enforcement, so the people that raid employers and fine employers for hiring illegal workers and screwing up the I-9 and that sort of thing. It used to be a lot more on, here's some training we're doing. We're going around the country and we're doing some training with employers and we're talking about the ways to hire foreign workers. And it was a little bit more education based. And so now when I get the news feeds, I would say well over half of them are, we just picked up this Guatemalan who's, wanted in 5 states for bad stuff, which is great. I mean, that's, great. But it's all about the deportations. It's all about the more police type action versus the more friendly, like work with your foreign workforce type stuff that we saw under the Obama administration. I don't think any of this is much of a surprise, but if any of you, my point is, if any of you want news feeds, let me know. I'm happy to direct you to those government websites. H-1B visas, we are still waiting on. So the executive order is suggesting some changes, but we haven't seen anything substantively yet on the H-1B visas, other than the government saying that we don't want your money to expedite these. We want this to take longer. So if you're a business trying to apply for an H-1B visa, the government has taken steps to make it a longer drawn out process, which is very frustrating for me, and many people that I work with that try to get H-1B visas. But again, not the most surprising thing in the whole world from the administration. Executive order aiming to improve accountability for veterans employees. I think that was one that got some press. Also, the fiduciary rule, which impacts brokers, financial institutions, financial professionals. So anyway, that's not as much of an HR rule and more of a professional liability, professional responsibility rule. But that's an executive order that's touches HR a little bit. That's delayed that fiduciary rule, which again has gotten quite a bit of press as well, mainly pushback and fighting on that fiduciary rule from the investment community. And then just this executive order that was part of a campaign promise that said, for every one regulation, the agency needs to get rid of 2 regulations. So like a two for one. I guess that's going to streamline business or something like that. Every regulation, not every regulation's made the same. Some regulations, like the I-9 regulations, are like 80 pages long, and it's just about the I-9 form. And some regulations actually, have not as much impact and might be, or have more impact and might be like 10 pages long. So, but whatever. That's the new executive order, 2 for 1. So, okay, moving on from the federal branch, the sick leave, paid sick and safety leave, and I think we just recently had a webinar on this exact topic. So 7 new states have paid sick leave laws. So we've got Connecticut, California, Massachusetts, Oregon, Vermont, Arizona, Washington. There's a bunch of cities, including Cook County and Chicago, although a lot of the cities in Cook County have opted out of this. And then, here locally, we've got Minneapolis and St. Paul, which, just on a lot of these were 7-1. They were implemented, and including Minneapolis and St. Paul, and both of those two, Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a lot of, and for those of you who are like on the HR hotline program and want to rewatch the webinar I did that's focused exactly on paid sick and safety leave, you can go on the website and watch that from like a month or two ago. But so many of these cities, they're just very similar. It's like, and states, it's like, for every hour worked, for every 30 hours worked, you're going to earn 1 hour of PTO, or for every 40 hours worked, you're going to earn 1 hour of PTO. And, this is starting. There is some widespread, this definitely is becoming more widespread, the paid sick and safety leave. We've gotten very little movement out of Congress on this issue. But this kind of goes hand in hand with minimum wages. And we've seen a lot, the dispersal, like I said earlier, of the minimum wages, it's going beyond just the coasts right now. In some pockets in the Midwest, it's really spreading all over. Now, right now, I would say sick and safety leave is a little bit behind minimum wage, but I would not be surprised if we continue to see the infiltration, if you want to call it, of these notions, of these sick and safety leave notions becoming very widespread beyond the coasts and beyond select cities in the Midwest. There's a lot of health reasons for wanting sick and safety leave time off, even for part-time workers. So a lot of employers, especially for professional employers, we don't worry about so much, but in hospitality and some other industries, where you're just not going to give somebody, a couple days of time off a year, or even like 5 days of time off, because they're just more of a low wage non-professional worker, or maybe they're part-time, and in your sick and safety leave policies, which are generally a matter of contract, absent any law on this, your sick and safety leave laws, they're not for part-time employees. They're only for employees that work, like, let's just call it 30 hours or 40 hours or more per week. And so many of these states, the whole idea is that they're giving time off, paid time off, to part-time workers. So you might be the greatest employer in the whole world, but you don't give paid time off to part-time workers. But now suddenly you're in New York or San Francisco or DC or Minneapolis or St. Paul, Chicago, and you're going to have to start giving paid time off to low-wage part-time workers. And it might not be a lot when all said and done per year. And then most of these have carryover provisions as well. And so we're talking about, so many employers don't allow for carryover. And I generally don't recommend employers giving carryover time from year to year. But now these laws, so many of these ordinances and these state laws are requiring that employers allow for some sort of carryover. So these, again, part-time, low-wage workers could actually save up and have some significant time off depending on how much they've been able to save up and how long they're working. So it can be, at a minimum, your policies need to be re-examined. If you're in any of these states or cities, almost certainly they're going to have to be tweaked a little bit. So if you're in any of these cities like New York or Minneapolis or St. Paul or any of these states, and if you haven't changed your PTO, or at least had it looked at, you're likely not going to be in compliance, at least with the letter of the law, and you probably should be looking at changing and updating those policies. There's also, for most of these places, there's also a requirement that you do a posting. So added to your laminated posters that are taking up valuable wall space. at your company. Things to watch for, that in this first one is kind of a big issue here in the Twin Cities, and we'll see what happens at with the courts. But the big issue here is, and this is not just in the Twin Cities, but it's a big issue in Chicago and I suspect other states, cities as well. Well, what if you're a suburban or an out-of-state company, but then you send a worker to work in Minneapolis, maybe as a consultant or just working at a Minneapolis facility for a month? Are they entitled to carryover, and are they entitled to the accrual of paid time off? I mean, they're not a Minneapolis employee. They're an employee, let's just say in Dallas, working for a month in Minneapolis. I mean, are they entitled to some sort of paid time off? Are they entitled to all the rights that are under, this Minneapolis rule? I mean, it just seems strange because they're based out of Dallas. Fortunately, a judge in Minneapolis said no. But these are going to be issues that they're going to come up. Chicago's got a nice provision where they say, you have to work a minimum number of hours, and you can't just be like going through the city of Chicago. You have to work a minimum number of hours before you're beholden and required to give paid time off under the Chicago rule. Minneapolis, the judge said, yeah, you've got to be you have to have a physical location as an employer in Minneapolis before you're going to have to be stuck with following this Minneapolis rule, and St. Paul will be the same. So we'll see what the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals say on that, if they agree, and hopefully they do agree, because that would be pretty crappy for employers who are in all over the country. Let's just say Dallas, and sending up workers up into Minneapolis or St. Paul, and having to suddenly know what the Minneapolis-St. Paul paid time off sick and safety rules are. Several states have implemented paid time off, paid family and medical leave, kind of similar to the sick and safety leave rules. So we've got California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island that have done this. New York just started. So they have New York State. I'm sorry. Just will start to take effect on their insurance-based paid family leave, where it's going to be, if you think kind of like an unemployment insurance or work comp type of insurance program, where employees would apply for reimbursement of lost wages due to like an FMLA type of event. That's going to take effect in New York State on January 1. But on July 1, employers had to start accruing the leave and starting to collect the payments and everything for this program. So July 1 gave the employers the chance to start kind of paying into and collecting for that program, but the program technically doesn't take effect until January 1, 2018. We've got several states that have looked at, and they're unnamed, but several states have looked at expanding childcare for 16 weeks. And we're starting to see that at the private sector. Business is actually way ahead of this. Big business, especially like the Facebooks and Googles and stuff of the world, where they're really doing a lot of paid time off and unpaid time off as well for long periods of time, kind of more along the European model. Of how time off works for like families and stuff like that. So states are looking at this, but we haven't seen a ton of success yet, or at least very widespread success, other than at some pretty high profile companies that have been doing it. And I think a lot of the big companies, especially in the tech sector, are trying to recruit millennials and keep women in the workplace, professional women in the workplace that are really valuable. Trying to have more of these paid time off or unpaid time off policies. I think business is driving that more than the governments are, which is probably in my mind how it should be. School-related parental leave. We've got a bunch of states, including Minnesota and California. The typical ones that like to give employees time off and paid time off. And so we've got a bunch of school-related leave where the employers have to give some sort of paid or unpaid time off in order to attend, school events. Think parent-teacher conferences or soccer games and that sort of thing. Every state's a little bit different in how they do this, but it has to be school-related activities. And so I think in Minnesota, for example, I think it's like off the top of my head, 16 hours per year that you need to give to an employee. Again, unpaid time off, they could use PTO. Most employers let them use PTO if they want, but 16 years of unpaid time off, you can't really stop them from going to a parent-teacher conference. Or a soccer game or that sort of thing. So we've started to see this along the lines of a sick and safety leave policies. We've started to see this expand as well recently, and so that's something. We've got these 10 states and DC that have done this. So be on the lookout. Again, if you've got employees in these states and other coastal states, just be prepared because it's likely coming your way as well. On the Affordable Care Act, your guess is as good as mine. I suspect it's dead. The whole redo of the Affordable Care Act. I always found it frustrating. Like for me, the whole debate is just kind of got away from what I found to be the most oppressive part of the Affordable Care Act, which is the employer mandate. But again, that's my world and probably your world as well. Nobody really talked about the employer mandate as much as they talked about the individual mandate and the exchanges and stuff. I don't know why. I guess I kind of understand why everything focused on the exchanges, but in any event, the Affordable Care Act that we've all grown to know and love and implement or ignore has I don't think anything's changing with it. It doesn't look like it. I'm not in Washington. I just know what I read and follow, but it just doesn't look like there's a lot of political will anymore for it. And my guess is that Congress will probably move on to tax reform, which might impact business, and maybe that'd be really, really great if they were to get that. But I suspect we're done with the ACA overhaul or undoing or whatever it is, at least for the time being. So pay attention. Obviously, I don't think this is the sort of news that you can get away from, and unless you really, really try. But yeah, Affordable Care Act, interesting. I would have guessed. I guess I'm a little shocked. If you just ask, if you want my opinion, I'm a little shocked that they weren't able to get it at least changed in some sort of capacity. So a little surprised, but we still have the Affordable Care Act. So I guess all of our training for the last 8 years, 8 years on all this and all the things that we've had to do to get ready for the Affordable Care Act and the employer mandate and all that, it's not going to be thrown out the window. That's the good news. You're going to be able to continue to do that reporting and make sure that all the complexities of the ACA are continued to, or your company is continuing to comply with and follow. So for better or worse, that's great. DOL memos. One interesting, so there are a couple Obama Department of Labor memos that that provided guidance. And so I went around on a speaking circuit in 2016, for example, and spoke about joint employer liability and how the Obama administration had completely, expanded the scope. And there are webinars on this. If anybody wants to listen to the webinars, they're on the, if you're on the HR Hotline program, you're welcome to listen to those. I'm sure they're riveting. And, but they're also kind of moot now because the Obama administration, their expansion of the joint employer liability definition, where you've got horizontal and vertical employer relationships. And so general contractors can be brought in for Department of Labor violations, for subcontractors much more readily under the Obama administration, for example, or end users can be brought in for wage hour violations from a temp agency that they're using contract workers or contingent workers from the temp agency, much more readily able to bring in end user employers on that. So that sort of liability is out there. Well, the Trump administration got rid of it. So in June, the Trump administration, the head of the Department of Labor, he came in, he's just confirmed, I believe, in late May, and he came in and said, we're not following the Obama administration interpretation of joint employers. So, my counsel and webinars on joint employer liability, I think we can now take that with a grain of salt, at least with regard to the Department of Labor. The National Labor Relations Board hasn't gotten rid of their interpretation yet, but the Department of Labor has. And so we still worry about it from violations of the National Labor Relations Act, and we still have to worry about Title VII with the EEOC. But as far as wage hour claims and other related Department of Labor claims go, the potential liability for employers in a joint employer situation has lessened significantly, if not gone away completely, with the Department of Labor, which is great. I think that's at least good for business, good for businesses. So here's some more stuff on that I kind of covered. Okay, I think I've got one more. Yes. Okay, one more. I'm done. This is like perfectly timed. This is what happened. 5 years into this, 5th year in these webinars, I can actually now stumble my way through and perfectly time ending these webinars. That's what experience, I guess, does for you on the webinar side. So the other one is on worker classification. Again, we've done webinars on this. I've gone on speaking tours to businesses and employer groups on this over the years, and the Trump administration got rid of that as well. So the Obama administration had expanded what the definition of an independent contractor would be. And they basically, I remember the executive director, I want to say it was like July 2015, came out with this memo and said, look, if it seems like it's going to be an independent contractor or an employee, if it smells like an employee, it is an employee. No more of these excuses like they're independent contractors. We're not going to just look at control, which is the old IRS way of looking at this to see if the employer controls the employee. Now they're just going to look at a lot of factors, and if the factors are weighing in favor of employment, and they're going to be looking at them as weighing more likely in favor of an employment relationship, then they're going to find an employment relationship, which means FICA and overtime pay and all that. Well, the Department of Labor has they've rescinded that memo. They haven't come out with their own interpretation, like how they're going to look at this, because worker classification, for those of you who have followed these webinars, we talk about like the Ubers of the world and the Lyfts of the world. There's a lot, this is a really hot area to get into, and there's a lot of lawsuits and stuff. And so, I wouldn't say that this is like the end-all be-all for businesses that the Trump administration has rescinded this memo, because the courts are still finding, regardless of the Department of Labor, the courts are still finding that people are employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So they're not going to be able to undo what's definitely a real trend, which is classifying and finding that independent contractors are truly employees. I think that ship sailed, and I think the courts are finding more and more and more support for it. However, if you're worried about executive action on this, and you're worried about the Department of Labor coming in and finding you and doing all that, I think that risk has lessened quite a bit. And so that's good. That's good news for businesses, but I don't think we're out of the woods, and I don't think we're going to be out of the woods for a long, for the foreseeable future on that. The only other thing I'll mention, and then we're going to wrap up here. The only other thing I would mention is that the Obama administration had gotten rid of opinion letters, which were great for attorneys and businesses, so we could kind of see like what the Department of Labor would think. So we could submit opinion letters to the government, and then they would publish them, and it would be really great guidance. So the Obama administration, for whatever reason, got rid of those, but the Trump administration is bringing them back. So I am really excited about that, because those are great fodder for understanding complex issues and how the government thinks of them. and they can be supportive for cases as well. But I'm really excited to start having opinion letters back, and so I hope you're excited about that as well. That's it. We're all done. Thank you all for your attendance today. And if you have any questions, I see people wrote a few questions, so I'll get back to them. But if you do have any questions or would like to talk about any of this, you're welcome to reach out to me or any of the other Thomson attorneys. And I look forward to next month's webinar. And have a nice month. Thanks.